Good afternoon. Welcome to my little collection of flutes for the day. I always enjoy doing these sessions, and each time I bring a slightly different variety of flutes, depending on which are my favorites. And I think I picked an especially good group of flutes today. I have a proposal in to do a talk together with the curator of the Dayton C. Miller collection at the next National Flute Association convention. And this was sort of the list I had made up for doing that. And so I'm kind of testing it out on you guys. So one of the things to understand from the beginning about the development of the flute is that most of the processes that happened that made the flute change were what we would consider evolutionary changes. They would make one little change and then another little change, and then they would adapt something somebody else did, and basically, went all the way from the 1-key flute up to 10-key flutes, just as an evolutionary thing. But there are two times in the history of the flute where instead of being evolutionary, it was a revolutionary change. And the first one of those was going from the Renaissance flute to the baroque flute, the Auditaire model baroque flute. So the Renaissance flute, you may know, was just one piece. It was basically just cylindrical. It had an embouchure hole. It had 6 finger holes. It had no key and no decoration. It was just a very, very simple tube. It's a deceptive instrument in how it looks, because it's actually very sophisticated. It looks like it would be kind of crude and make a crude sound, but really they make an amazingly beautiful and expressive sound, and they have a bigger range, strangely, than the baroque flute. But anyway, around 1685, the Auditaire family invented the new baroque flute. And what they did was they changed, instead of the flute being entirely cylindrical, it has a cylindrical head joint and a conical body. So it's tapering from here down to here, and they also added this key. And that pretty much transformed the instrument. It changed the way the high register worked, and it made a bigger, richer sound. And the French were, their focus with the flute was, these early flutes was to be very rich and deep in sound. And of course, they were also at a low pitch. So this is at A392. Has a really, really beautiful, sweet sound, but completely different than the Renaissance flute. So that was the first revolutionary change, and we'll get to the second one later. You may be able to guess what that might be. But as the baroque flute developed, one of the first big developments was that this model of flute, which was popular until about 1720, is made in 3 pieces. There's the head, and there's the body, and there's the foot. And those are, all of the flutes up to that point were made that way, all of the baroque flutes. And then someone came along, possibly Pierre Naust, and decided that they could do more interesting things with the bore and use smaller pieces of wood if they made these 2 joints separately. So from then on, for the most part, we get a left-hand joint, a right-hand joint, a foot, and a head joint. And most of you, I think the majority of you, play the baroque flute, but I'll just mention the basic characteristics of the baroque flute are the instrument is in D major. And so when you're playing in D major, you get a pretty even scale. what happens when we're not in D major is that we have to use fingerings that cause a difference in the sound and the timbre of the note. So the difference between a B and a B flat, or A and G sharp, F sharp and F natural. So each note on the Baroque flute has kind of a separate character from one another, especially the notes that are not in the D major scale. Even the notes in the D major scale do sound different. Like when I hear somebody play the Baroque flute, I can tell what note they're playing by the way the sound is. I don't have perfect pitch, but I can hear a G. A G has a particular sound. And when you get into the accidentals, it's even more different. So I think what started happening in the development of the flute at this point, as we go into what we would call the classical era flute. So this is a flute that Debian could have used. So Debian was the most famous French flutist of the second half of the 18th century. He was the first big flute professor at the Paris Conservatory. And interestingly, even though people had started adding some keys to the flute, Debian did not like keys. And I'll explain that a little more in a minute when we talk about keys. But the other thing that happened in the classical flute is it became brighter, and it had a more facile third octave. So it's like, if you look at Auditer's music, it's almost all within the range of 2 octaves. And sometimes he'll have a special high note in there, but those 2 octaves is basically what it is. And when we get into the second half of the 18th century, the character of the flute starts to change, and it becomes good at playing in the high register. So a little bit sort of more balanced out by comparison. This is a very special flute made by Prudent, who was a Paris maker. This was probably about 1780 this was made. And Prudent was famous for his bassoons. Almost certainly his bassoons were used in Rameau's orchestra, and certainly his flutes could have been as well. I'll play you just a really short example here. So this is a piece by Hugo, who was a contemporary of Debian, and he was the person at the Paris Conservatory who thought keys were good. And Debian, who was more famous, thought the keys were bad, other than the one key. But they both wrote really beautiful music, and there's basically no difference between music that was written for people who played the keyed flute and people who didn't. That's an important thing to know. You can't look at a piece and say, oh, that was written for the 5-key flute. Pretty much can't do that. So I'll just play a little bit of an adagio movement. Another thing that's unusual about this flute is that it actually plays with just a little bit of extension. It plays at A415, and is actually very rare to find original flutes that play at 415. They normally play lower than 415 or higher. Very seldom will they work at 415. But there are a group of these French classical flutes which have multiple joints. This one has 3 joints, and with the longest joint, it's very close to 415. And the flute has probably shrunk, so it could actually have been at 415 originally. So you can hear it has a really sweet and a very pure sound to it. It has a lot of ring to it. From about the same time, just a little bit later, we started having more keys. So this is a flute by Heinrich Grenser, an original. All the rest of these are original flutes, other than these two Baroque ones. And this one has 5 keys, is that right? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, but a kind of unusual arrangement of them. First of all, just so we have an idea of what the keys are for. When the keys first started being added, the English called them trillers. It's like it made it really easy to do trills on various notes where the trills don't sound so good on the Baroque flute. So that was one of the first things they did. But the real object of it was that you could make a note that had a key the same volume as a note in the D major scale. So my F, if I play it without the key, so it has the same quality as the note in the D major scale. And so the first keys that were added were the B flat key for the thumb, which doesn't work like the B flat key on the modern flute because you don't have your finger on it all the time. It's a different thing. The G sharp key, which does work basically like the modern flute. And the F key. To play an F, you finger an E, and then you open that key, and that gives you an F. To play an F sharp, better in tune than we can on the Baroque flute, you use the F key along with the first finger. So on Baroque flute, you would just finger it like this with the key. On this flute, you would finger it like this. Then there is this special key down here, which is what's called the long F key. If you think about, if you're playing a D and you want to play an F, you have to lift up this finger, move it over here, and put it down. And you can't do that if you're slurring, right? Because you're going to get D, E, F. So they invented a second way to play the F using this key. So if you go D, F, D, F, D, F, it accomplishes the same thing. And actually on this flute, it uses a method where there's actually only one hole, and both of those keys open the flap of that hole. Later flutes, they just had 2 different holes, because this means you're activating 2 springs when you do this, so it is not as good. But this flute, strangely, doesn't have a C key. Most flutes that would have a long F key, that long F key we think of as the 6th key that was added, and the C key is the 5th key. But like this flute does not have a C key. So one of the things that we know, and you can see it from looking at original flutes, is that people would buy a flute with the keys they liked. Like somebody just didn't like having to hop over here to use the C key, and so they said, well, I don't want to pay the extra money for having a C key, so forget it. And it was very common to have kind of strange mixtures of keys, especially after the 4 keys. You have the 4 basic keys, and then whatever is added is a separate thing. So this is a German flute instead of a French flute. It's important to know that each country has their own ideals about the sound. Just as a gamba would, or a harpsichord would, or an organ, the flutes are the same way. So the French wanted an instrument that was very pure and very sweet, and it didn't particularly need to be loud. And that's something that continues into the 19th century for France. In Germany, they wanted it to be a little louder and a little bit more colorful. And I'll show you some things in a while that kind of show what they were into technologically. And the English flutes, the English were interested in things being loud. This somewhat came from Charles Nicholson, the famous flutist from the 1820s and 30s, who was a very loud player, and people really liked that. He also did all kinds of crazy stuff. He was a showman on the flute, kind of. But let me just play a little bit of this flute to compare with the French one that I just did. So this is just a little excerpt from a piece for solo flute, which is an arrangement of almost the entire Magic Flute. It has like 40 of the themes of the Magic Flute, written by a German composer named Behrens, who wrote some fairly virtuoso music for the flute. This is not particularly virtuoso, or I wouldn't be playing it, but it still is nice, and it fits very nicely on this flute. Another thing to notice about this flute, I mentioned that the French flute was basically at 415. This one is at around 444. So this is high. I'll talk about pitch after I play a little bit here. You can hear tonally how different this flute sounds, right? It sounds really bright. Just to play a few notes. Interestingly, this fancy flute with keys is not as well in tune as this one-key flute, which is kind of something that happens. All right, as we progress into the 19th century, the flute makers get better at using keys. These early keys are kind of clunky on this Grenser model flute. But this was made in 1833 by Joseph Sax, who was the father of Adolph Sax, the inventor of the saxophone. And he made ultra deluxe flutes. Almost all of the extant flutes by him have huge amounts of silver on them, and they're made out of like the best exotic woods. They're really quite extraordinary, and they play beautifully. This one has a totally unique foot joint. When you look at these up close, you'll see that the way the keys work are quite strange. So you press the tip here and you get a C sharp. You press here and you get a C. And there's even a tiny little roller to help you get from the C sharp to the C back and forth. It's very unusual. And this flute is at A435. That's a very important pitch. So in France in the 19th century, they did adapt A435 as a standard. That didn't mean everybody used a 435, but it was kind of declared for the first time. This was an official pitch. The government said, this is the pitch. And so a lot of instruments are made to play at 435. Sometimes you find instruments with a tuning slide. So this part moves in and out. There's inside of here, there's a metal sleeve. And so there's two metal parts. So this is actually lined with metal, and there's metal up to about here. And often the French flutes, if you push them all the way in, will work at 440, and if you pull them pretty far out, they'll work at 440 and 430. So it's a really nice range when you find flutes like that, because you can use those ranges quite practically. My next example is an instrument made of ivory. So obviously, different materials were part of flute making much more than they are today. If you go to the flute store, what are you going to see? You're going to see a whole bunch of flutes that all look exactly the same. The differences between the brands and the way they look. I mean, I can't even see it unless I'm really trying to see it. There's so little difference between the flutes. Whereas, especially in the 19th century, they went crazy and had millions of different kinds of flutes. So ivory was a material that they made fancy instruments out of. This was made by an English maker, Milhouse, probably around the same time as that French flute, 1830s. And it has 8 keys, but actually it has 9 keys. So this has another variation, which is the B flat thumb key, which we get from the 4 key up, but it also has a right hand B flat key. And again, it's opening the same hole. You just can play it from either side. we see as we progress into the 19th century that flutists got more and more interested in having alternative ways of playing things. We tend to be fixated on a certain group of fingerings that we think of. These are the baroque flute fingerings or whatever. In the 19th century, they, for instance, the German treatise by Fürstenau, he has 11 different fingerings for C. And so, and we find that C is one of the difficult notes when I pick up a flute to play because I don't remember exactly which C sounds the best. So we have the baroque flute fingered C, and then in the 19th century they used the fingering we use for the second octave C. They didn't really use that in the baroque period that I can see, but in the 19th century they used that, and then they had the C key, and then you could also play them by playing a low C and blowing up the harmonic, and various other versions. So for Fürstenau, it depended on the musical context mostly, not so much technical. It was like you want the note to be really soft and mysterious, or you want the note to be really strong. It was all built into the music, and there are some great examples from the time which actually tell you which fingering to use. They have a little number, and you can look it up on the fingering chart. And there's a young German woman, Anna Puslauch, who is an expert on that and actually has recorded a couple of those pieces using all the correct Fürstenau fingerings. Very, very interesting stuff. This has a fairly large embouchure hole. If you compare it to the embouchure hole on a baroque flute, can you see the difference? It's about twice as big. This is on the large size even for its time, but it's very beautiful flute. This is one of only, actually this is the only known ivory flute by Milhouse. And it came originally from Cuba. I bought it from somebody in Florida who got it from Cuba. So I'm sure there's a great story there. It came over with some French government or English government person. So another country that made really, really good flutes, in some ways, I think a lot of people think the best flutes were the Viennese. They kind of were on the Germanic side of things, but they made really refined instruments, and they were pretty much the first ones to start having a kind of square embouchure hole. Can you see that? It's a square with sort of rounded edges, and this is kind of a classic Viennese embouchure hole, and it allows for quite a big sound out of the flute. I had this at the convention in August, and some of my European flute friends were going crazy over this flute and said, well, that's the flute to play the Brahms symphonies on, because it's got this big sound, but it's got this beautiful color to it. it's a super, super nice. This was an eBay find. One of my better ones. It actually has silver keys, and in the 19th century, they usually used what's called German silver, which is nickel, and German silver has actually no silver in it. It was a very cheap material, whereas silver was very expensive. So when you have actual silver keys on a flute, that means somebody spent some real money to get it. All right. Let's jump ahead to the Second Revolution. So the Second Revolution, of course, was Theobald Boehm. And what most flutists don't realize, and I didn't realize it until I started collecting flutes, was that the first model of flute that Boehm came out with was a Conical Boehm flute, the conical flute that Boehm designed, not the cylindrical flute that everyone plays now. So this was a totally different instrument. It used the same fingerings as the modern flute does, but it sounds more like, you know, one of these flutes. And so Boehm brought this out in 1832, and he spent between 1832 and 1836 traveling around Europe playing this flute for people and trying to sell them. And he got amazing reviews. People said, that just is incredible how that flute sounds. And and flutists would be like, oh yes, let me try this. It sounds wonderful. And they tried it and they said, well, I don't want to play that flute. Because besides the fact that everything has a key on it, which was sort of not very naturalistic, it made basic changes to the fingering. So for 300 years, that had been an F sharp, and now that was an F sharp, and this was an F natural. And the second thing that he did was he insisted on open G sharp. So that meant in order to play G natural, you press down the G sharp key. And again, for a million years, that G sharp was made by pressing down the key. And he made a large square embouchure and an undercut area where your lip goes. And basically, a flutist would pick it up and they would realize that they were going to have to learn to play the flute over again if they got one of these things. So what happened eventually was that the company of Godfroy in Paris, together with Louis Lotte, who worked with him, they sort of adapted Boehm's design to make it something that French people would like. And so the sound of the French Conical Boehm flute is really super similar to the sound of these flutes. And so one of the things they did was they just used the same embouchure hole they'd been using. So anybody who made a beautiful sound on their simple system Godfroy flute was going to sound beautiful on one of these. They changed, so it's a closed G sharp. They got rid of the open G sharp. They couldn't do anything about the F natural, but the flutist had less stuff that they had to worry about. And the other, the big thing was that they made it sound like a French flute instead of like a German flute. And so French flutists started adopting it. And really, the whole popularity of the modern flute came out of the French working on the flute, the Louis Lotte flutes, which came in the 1880s and 70s. That's what became the modern flute that everybody plays today, not really the one that Boehm designed, but the modified French flute. So I was going to play a little example. My technology works. So this is a little piece by Donjon, and this is played with a Broadwood piano, played by David Brightman from pretty much the same time, 1870-ish. So you can hear the sweetness of the sound. It doesn't have any of the kind of hard edge that the cylindrical flute has, especially the metal flute. So then in 1847, Boehm introduced the cylindrical flute, which we know as the modern flute. This one was made in 1879, and this was made by what we call the Villette shop. So Louis Lott, I don't remember his dates, but he made his flutes for a while, and then his foreman, Mr. Villette, took over the shop, and he made a bunch of changes to the flute that made it. I would say most modern players think the Villette flutes are the best of the Louis Lott flutes. So the Louis Lott flutes were softer. They were soft and really sweet and really refined, but they don't quite have the breadth to them that these later ones have. But you can all try it and see. And when you try this flute, one of the things to do is to play the real high register, play all the way up, because one of the big differences between the modern flute and this flute is that everything on this flute is sweet, including going all the way up high. There's no screechiness. And I think the reason that the modern flute has gone astray in that regard is just that the main thing they care about now is to make the flute louder. And so a lot of the little subtleties that were a natural part of an instrument like this are lost in most modern flute making. So it's fun to experiment with that. Now, as the Boehm flute was finally catching on, it's important to know that the simple system flute, as we call it, this basic keyed flute, continued, and people kept inventing things. So this is a flute invented by Jean Toulouse, the famous French flutist from the middle of the 19th century, and this was a model which he called the Flute Perfectionée. And it was made entirely in reaction to these conical Boehm flutes. And it has rods and axles like a Boehm flute. And he adds some extra trill keys. He does some funny business with the thumb keys, because this thumb key gives you a C, and this thumb key gives you a B flat. That's kind of disturbing. But anyway, he made this design, which was extremely sophisticated, and they only made, well, the shop that Toulouse had was Toulouse and Nonon. Nonon was really the flute maker, and Toulouse was kind of designing. But they only made pretty fancy flutes. These were probably the most expensive, other than a crystal flute, that you could get. And this is an example by Godfroy. It's one of two known, and it's in incredible condition. It looks like it was made last week. It's really, and the case has a date of 1879, which is very late for a flute perfectionée, so that's kind of a mystery. But the English, I don't have an example here, but one of the other things they did when the Boehm flute came out was they tried to make a Boehm flute, but make the fingerings the same as the old flute. So there are flutes where, that's an F instead of an F sharp, but with a Boehm tube and a Boehm head. Unfortunately, most of those flutes are at English high pitch, which was 454. So completely unusable by anybody these days except for a band of old instruments. So the final one I wanted to show you, and it is not doing anything other than squeaking at the moment, but this is what's called the Schwedler flute. And this was probably the most extreme version of the simple system flute, and it was quite popular as an orchestral instrument. I think the flutist in the Leipzig Gewandhaus, I think Schwedler was a flutist in the Leipzig Gewandhaus, and a number of really, really famous flute repertoire. Reinke, for instance, was written for this kind of a flute. They had a really big sound. I wish it would work, but it's just leaking. Oh. It's hard to play, but you can hear how loud it is. I mean, compared to it's twice as loud. So it was a real orchestral instrument. And it continues this thing that the English or that the Germans were so fond of having two ways to play a certain note. So like this one has a C key here and another C key up here. It has a B flat there, another B flat there. Just thinking, let's see what G sharp. Yeah, and they added some new high trill keys. anyway, it's a quite interesting thing. And then the final thing, I just wanted to recognize the fact that progress of a sort is made in being able to 3D print baroque flutes. It's not that they are better than buying a beautiful Martin Venner flute, but this costs $300 instead of $2,200. So they're an amazing way for people to get started on baroque flute, and in my opinion, they're a lot better than the Alos and the Yamaha flutes. I think they're more flexible, and it feels more like you're playing a wooden flute. It doesn't seem when you're playing it like it's plastic. So, I think the final thing I want to leave with you is the idea that each of these flutes is perfect for the music that it was intended. They all just do exactly what that music needed, and hearing original 19th century as well as 18th century flute music on the original flutes is so much more engaging and interesting than hearing it on the modern flute, because the modern flute is so homogenized, and also modern flutists are trained to just, there's no difference between anything, right? You're just trying to be seamless through, which is beautiful in itself. I have nothing against the modern flute, really. But I think, the historical flutes really allow you to do things that you can't do otherwise. And they're really fun to play. So, come on up and play. Questions?